Didn't say it was
Well,
hospitalized.
it's all right. I know. I know all about it. Been through the whole Melba stuff. And as I said before, in order to get the entirely new picture, which you have all seen coming out in this class, you have to go and look for something different, completely different, radically different. Qualitatively different as well as, well, not quantitatively different in terms of movement. How many of you, as you are sitting on your chairs right now, I, even with my legs crossed, can do this, can go in there and feel yourself turn your pelvis under by ever so little, but in so doing you activate that whole hinge that goes across and is sort of defined by the pubes. Mac almost has it.
Yeah, I can.
You can,
Yeah.
but you couldn't have 2 weeks ago.
No, Saturday, Friday really opened it up.
Only 1 week ago you couldn't have.
Till Friday, I never felt myself bending right on the hinge, right here, this hinge.
Right now you can feel yourself flexing by shortening the psoas. I mean,
Lengthening the psoas, she said.
yeah, but I mean by going in there.
Yes, I can feel that right there.
Before Friday, when you bent from your shoulders.
Like this, I can't
That's
do
right.
it now.
You can't do it now. Okay, you got it made. You graduated.
But I don't feel my psoas lengthen.
With your fingertips you can, and as you put your fingers there, when it's no longer sore, you will find that that muscle falls back and your fingers go after it. And what you can call that except lengthening, I don't know.
What I'm confused is across the pelvic hinge, the
Okay.
psoas should shorten rather than lengthen.
It doesn't. Feel it.
It's a lengthen contraction.
Credo in unum Deo.
So help you gravity. I don't know, Mac. It may be that after we all get really familiar and looking at this phenomenon, we can get a set of words together which will be more acceptable. At this point,
Dissect some psoas muscles and see what's...
all right, I agree with you. I don't have the opportunity.
Well, I do.
When I did this section, it was long before I had such funny ideas. Long before. And you see, your dissection isn't going to tell you a thing. Your dissection is going to tell you what was you before last Friday, but it's not going to tell you what is you as of this Monday. Even Peter over there has a certain greater awareness of his psoas today. Jim Horiskis doesn't know he's got a psoas, and neither does Ed. And Beverly is 25% up. And Mike could find his psoas, but he isn't looking for it.
I'm looking at the bus anyway.
That's the problem. Owen could find his psoas, but he's working so blame hard that he can't feel it. And Bob doesn't know anything about it, and Dale knows very little about it. And that guy back there, he'll find it pretty soon.
You're not as fast as Gordon Fraser.
Okay. He told you it's his first life on earth, and God knows my 2000th or something. So I'm kind of worn down a little So anyhow, Gordon couldn't, I bet you nickel Gordon wouldn't be able to see his psoas. Anyway, let's get back on this job. Now, having found that psoas.
Do you want to tell me what to give Peter?
Oh, is Peter here? Yeah. Excuse me just a minute. We'll take him. Are you on your way now? Cars out there, it's headed north?
Oh, they're leaving. That's in
George Fraser went right around here and he said, you need to live, you need to need
Oh, they're right down like that. Well,
It's relative. It's relative, so it's licensed by Slacks, but it's relative what's attached to it. Well, I have to understand this, and I have to understand.
We're gonna have to go down to Morgan, looking at a few PMs.
Right up the bank road?
Yeah.
Okay.
Have a good
Have a good trip to you.
here.
Oh, Peter, get some oil for your elbows. So, now you see, having found out that there is a SOS, now in order to establish the span of that SOS, you are going to have to get those lumbars and that lumbar sacral hinge where it belongs. Because otherwise, what organizes the lumbars, which are the determinants, the precise determinants of the psoas? You see, you can go round and round and round this mountain. And as you go further along the circumference, you look at the top, and it's the same top, but you see it. I mean, you see another determinant of what that mountain is and where it is and how it is. And what I'm trying to do is to keep you moving round and round this mountain, not simply looking at one set of values which only determine the east side. And you can look at a sacrum as determining a pelvis, but you can look at a sacrum as determining lumbars. They jolly well better, too. And you see, when that sacrum doesn't determine a lumbar, as it doesn't in the case of spondylolisthesis, then you're really in trouble. Then you've got a big job on your hands. And this guy, Joe Mulkey, is he coming in today, did you say, Lee?
Yes.
Some of you saw him 5 weeks ago, and you will be able to see him today, and and to what extent he's come further, and to some extent, Fritz there will tell you. Did we have a picture of him, Fritz, do you remember?
I don't think we took a picture.
Yeah, that's...
We
Did
have
we- Did we get something? I didn't realize it. He
Well, we
ordered his
took-
x-rays. I don't know if they've come yet or not. He said Mackey's for it.
But you see there, where there is an actual slipping on the hinge between the sacrum and the lumbar, there it becomes impossible for that psoas to get the kind of positioning that makes it possible for it to work. And so it is just literally geared out, as the reverse gear in your car is geared out when you're going ahead, or the other way around. The going ahead gear is geared out when you go into reverse. And this makes it for a very complicated problem. So here, once again, you now have your 6th hour in its, in that particular perspective. And you remember that you are getting your 6th hour organized. You are getting your sacrum organized through the relationship that you can establish between the outside and the inside through the piriformis muscle, through the obturatus, perhaps. If you want to look at it, a little longer range view through the obturatus. And then, if you've done a really good job, you've done about all you can do at one end of the line. And you've got to go up to the other end of the line. And you've got to go up to the head. You've got to try to establish the span of the head. Span of the neck. Because the way that neck spans will determine the way the rib cage sits. And the way the rib cage sits in turn will determine the way the neck spans. And if your first and second and third ribs aren't up high enough, as for example, Malcolm, Owen, lesser extent Dale, but not as serious, you can't get those lower ribs that are determining the position and span and tone of the diaphragm to do this normally. So once again, even in that 7th hour, you are still playing with psoas-diaphragm relationships. Now, when you get through with your work around the neck, in other words, when you have done what you can to get the first and second ribs up where they belong, then you have to go and try to organize the trapezius muscle to get the 7th and 8th and 9th ribs where they belong. And you do that, you remember, by sitting them on the floor and bringing the trapezius muscle down and wide to where it can sit back the way the psoas does when you flex it. And literally that trapezius muscle can sit back as you flex. Never did before. And you see, these basic, fundamental, different concepts are as clear to you as the nose on anybody's face when you've seen them. You know it's there, you see it there, you work with it there, and you're going to have a lifetime of argument about it. Because the trapezius can't go down when it flexes, how can it? It's got to shorten, but it don't. It lengthens. And all those real good books that those real good kinesiologists have spent their lives writing contain the old assumption. And they're all written around those old assumptions, which were the way those particular types of aberrated bodies worked. And these boys and girls are not going, it isn't that they're not going to be willing to hear you, but that for quite a long time they're not going to be able to hear you because they've been trained in the other thinking. You're going to have a large-sized job on your hands conveying to these people. And the only way you can do it is by putting them on the floor and doing it. So, what with one thing and another, I'm sending you out into the world. What did the good Lord have to say about it? To preach the gospel and to heal the sick, and etc., etc. And they had a bad time too. But you see, you have to change certain basic assumptions before you can get that changed body. Now, this is why you go back to your random body. This is why you give me this whole big yarn about habit. I can't tell you how many thousand times that guy Jerry is going to tell me about habit pattern before he really gets up out of that crunched-in thing you stop.
Am I still crunched in?
You sure are.
Take a picture of yourself.
The only thing is you're only half as crunched in as you were 2 weeks ago.
I feel less.
Yeah, you feel less, and this seems to you a lot.
Yes.
But you see, what you would say to me, even if he didn't say, well, he's been in the habit of sitting this way for all this time. But what I say to you is, that there's stuff there lacking. When the stuff that's lacking is built in, he will not be comfortable as he squinches in.
I would never say that this is a matter of habit.
Well,
Because I'm aware of what's happening to me, that it's
all
not
right,
habit.
these people would say it's a matter of habit. He's still sitting with the same habit that he had 2 weeks ago.
No, I feel that things that were a habit that I can't get into now. I'm aware of that already. Things that
Yeah.
used to be, if you want to say habit, I never thought of it that way. But I can't get in that position anymore.
Okay, I still think everybody has, kind of heard what I had to say, whether you happen to be the one that calls it habit. But, you see, before you change one of these postures that we would call a habit posture, you have to get in so very deep. Because that's where it lives and you can't change it where it doesn't live. And if you haven't the physical strength and the physical pursuit of this, if you haven't the ability to pursue it to where it lives, you can't do it. That's all there is to it. Okay, now, we got to the 7th hour, and we got to the 8th hour, which you remember is part of the job of organizing girdles. And you remember that in the 8th hour we made up our mind that we had to find out which girdle was in the holding position. Which one could we release and get the most general body release from? And you all remember. You remember Frank, for instance, how much change there was in his upper girdle by virtue of working on his legs. And you remember many other people in this room in the same situation. If you made the right choice, you got the right results. We didn't have any example of making a wrong choice. If this class were given the way it should be given, we would take enough time that we could afford to make mistakes in order to rectify them. But we never can do this because of the fact that we're setting up with people who are already have economic burdens on their shoulders of running a business and paying the bills for a family and this sort of thing. But there's going to have to be a time when that's done. And in the old days, every once in a while, I used to do that. I used to let some of these very bright guys that knew that they knew it all take a man apart for about 40 minutes. And the more they took him apart, the more confused they were. But at any rate, they got the message that you can take them apart and you can do a heck of a lot of damage. Fortunately, they can't ever be taken apart to the place where they can't be put together again. I don't think. I've certainly never seen it. By the person who knows how to do it. But the reference has to be back to somebody else. You see, the sad part about it is that a man who's stupid enough not to see that he's taken the thing apart in the beginning is also egotistical enough that he can't refer the guy to somebody else to correct his mistake. So that there's room for a lot of damage in there. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. I didn't do it. So then we were, as you saw, concerned with girdles. Now, in general, also as you saw and as I told you, in general, the concern in the 7th, in the 8th hour, will be with the girdle at the opposite end, will be with the pelvic girdle. Because as you have seen, there's always this alternation between top and bottom. And this is nothing mystical. This is just if you loosen the top, you got to take it in at the bottom to maintain the span. It's that simple. But it has very practical rewards. You get, for instance, poor old Max so sore that he can't put his own hands in it, let alone mine. And then you go up to the top of it and you let it heal down there. By the time you get back to it 10 days or 2 weeks from now, he's forgotten that it was so sore. Then he lets you in again. See what I'm talking about. And so in general, you would go from the head to the pelvic girdle. But sometimes other things are indicated. Oh yeah, it was Bob triangle, where we have the upper girdle. Now that upper girdle work consists in, and most of what we're going to be doing today as a 9th hour, you see the 9th hour has to be the other end of the 8th hour. If you start with the pelvic girdle, you've got to go to the shoulder girdle. If you start with the shoulder girdle, you've got to go to the pelvic girdle. But that pelvic girdle work, that shoulder girdle work, well, whether it be in the 8th hour or whether it be in the 9th hour, has got to take into consideration the posture of the arms. Now, what determines how an arm is held? And the answer is lots of things. The answer is the way a pectoral is attached, the way the pectoral minor is attached, the way the trapezius, the latissimus is attached, as well as the muscles that are within the arm itself. And all of these things have to be looked to and balanced in order to get the kind of balance that you need to establish the span of this electrical system that runs from the tail to the head. All of them. Now, it is interesting that it doesn't make any difference whatsoever how much work you do locally on those arm muscles. You will not get those arms placed until you understand that when arm muscles are balanced, the elbow moves straight out and straight in. And there was one old duck who had something to say about this, and he said something about local something or other determining muscular movement, muscles, muscular position, but the brain determines movement. And here you begin to involve some kind of central innervation that begins to tell these muscles how to balance each other. And if you start with a young enough person or a free enough person, you can actually organize that shoulder girdle simply by mind-body directions, as Mrs. Lee would have called them. You tell the elbow to go straight out, and presently it will go straight out, and in so doing it will balance all these other muscles. But as people get older, and as they get more, quote, habit patterns, unquote, they get more deterioration of the flesh, and the mind can no longer get in there and really reorganize it. So somebody's fingers have to get in there. And it's the same old story. Add energy to it. But the problem of the shoulder girdle, of the 8th hour, that is the shoulder end of the line, is a different problem than the problem at the pelvic end of the line. Because the shoulder, the arms are doing things, but they are not supporting weights. They are not transmitting weights, carrying weights, lifting weights. You see, the arms in general are not really fighting gravity to any great extent, to as great an extent, as the legs, which have to transmit that whole 170 pounds of a man, or 210 pounds of a man. You see, that's a big job. It's a heavy job. And in that it is a heavy job, it limits the degree of the levels of motion, the freedom, the degrees of freedom with which this can be accomplished. And the shoulders can have much more freedom in terms of the way they move than the legs do, because they don't have this problem, this gravity problem, as a major problem. It's a minor problem, of course. But so we now get to the place where all movement that begins, that involves the arms, must begin at the elbow, either the inside or the outside of the elbow. Now, when you do this, you are getting an entirely different integration of everything else that's concerned with the shoulder girdle. And once again, all this vast wealth of information of kinesthetics, all this vast study, has to be looked at again and revised again and re-understood in terms of the energy patterns that arise in this connection. So now, today, we are going to be doing a very great, practically all of what we are going to be doing today are going to be shoulder, upper body organizations. And you will begin to see how this works out. But bear it in mind, be willing to be able to see it and willing to see that whole organization, somebody else will have to answer that because Lee is away. That whole organization has to do with directions in arm movement, where you start. What was it, Dale? Anything?
For Robert.
Oh, for Robert. Probably Mussolini. Anyway, that's the story for today, and that's what we will be seeing coming up. Now, if it's at all possible for really what we were talking about yesterday. You know, when I looked at the end of the first hour and the beginning of the second hour, the end of the second hour and the beginning of the third hour, and that sort of thing. That's what I was talking about yesterday. I was talking about the specificity with which you should be able to tell. Dale, I swear, I'm going to take you on myself, and if I do, you're going to be sorry. I admit you have a problem because those legs of yours don't fit anywhere. The seat is too low.
I could help it, but I couldn't.
Well, you can't really help it. What do you do with those legs except try to make them shorter by turning them under? I know all this. Going back to where this eruption started. The specificity with which you should be able to look at a guy and tell where he has been, so to speak, how far along the road someone has taken him, and more or less what they have neglected to do, assuming they have neglected to do something, because you will find that you won't be able to do your fifth hour properly if they haven't done their fourth hour properly. It happens many, many times. The people will go from one of these coasts to the other and go into Dick's or come the other direction and go into one of you people into your office, and partly it's a game they're playing with you, partly it's that they don't believe you can see the difference, partly, I think mostly it's a game they're playing with you. Well, let's see if that guy is so damn smart. And they don't tell you, they're not honest in terms of their history. I think it was Stacy Mills that was talking in the class, in the Los Angeles class, about some guy that came in to her and swore that he had never had any Rolfing. And she tried to. She started in with the first hour, and her fingers immediately told her that this wouldn't work. And then she looked at him for the second hour. No, that wasn't right. And she finally traced him up to the 6th hour, and there she lost him. And finally, the guy actually admitted to the fact that Dick Demerly had given him 6 hours of work. But you see, his point was that he wasn't contributing anything. He was paying for this, and by golly, he was going to make her work. And that's the way it goes. So you've got to be prepared for all these little eventualities and use your judgment. Now, if they haven't had the 6th hour, your hands will tell you right now when you put your hands into those rotators. If they haven't had the 2nd hour, your hands will tell you right now when you put your hands around those ankles and shins. You see what I'm telling you? This is a little trick on which they're going to try to hang you up because stories get around. This story that I'm telling you will get around. And there'll always be those kindly people who are willing to contribute to the joy of the universe by seeing whether they can't make it work. Well, they don't know on anybody else that the work has been done, but they're not going to know on me whether the work has been done, you know? Always those people. So remember that it says in the recipe that you can tell what work has been done. If you can't see, you can feel. And that was basically the milestone business. There was another little bit about milestones too. If you were real sharp, you saw that the end of each hour sort of took you into the next hour. That the end of the first hour called for a certain degree of lengthening of the back to make the man more comfortable between his first and second hour. You see, you were finishing the first hour, but you were going into the second hour. Some of you noticed that at the end of the second hour, you may have felt inclined to or done something about easing around the whole spine, getting ready for the 3rd hour. You may have had this in your hands, so to speak. The lengthening that was due to come up along the side. You see, as you looked at that man, it became obvious to you at the end of the 2nd hour what his 3rd hour needs were going to be, and in your head you knew the recipe anyway. And you would see, perhaps, that that was too short, and you would, just because you couldn't control your hands, you'd go along and prepare for that 3rd hour. And at the end of the 3rd hour, as you looked at it, you saw that these anterior superior spines weren't at all happy. And you recognized the fact that if they stayed that unhappy, you were going to have trouble with your 4th hour. So you would probably do something in there to relieve those anterior superior spines, making it more easy for you to get into the 4th hour. And in the 5th hour, you know how many times you tried to organize the pubes and the symphysis simply in order to relieve the strain which was involved by doing the 4th hour and not going on to the 5th hour. Because this is really one process. It's really a spiral sort of thing, and as you get around to the end of 1 hour, it's very apparent to you where the strain is going to be that's screaming for the next hour. And the more you go on in this work, the more you are aware of the fact. And the more you are aware of the fact that this is a spiral processing, and it's going up, and when you stop at the end of an hour, you're being fairly arbitrary. You're being arbitrary because you know perfectly well that you can't keep going with that guy forever. He gets too tired. And that time is necessary for consolidation and so forth and so forth. But time isn't necessary for the progression. The road of the progression is traced right along from the beginning. And this is why I react as I reacted yesterday about Bob Hall. If these people could really work simply with that recipe until they saw the whole thing going. And then they could find something new that they could put in that would add to it, then I'd be all for it. But the problem is that the people that come to you and talk to me about, I think it would be a wonderful idea if you did so-and-so, are always the people who are doing an inadequate job of processing. That is, they don't really have the complete feel for how this progression goes. Now, I don't say that this is the final word, but I do say that until you know this word, you can't add a word to it that's going to logically enhance that procedure. This is all I'm saying. I'm not saying that this is the final word. I don't think it is. But I do think it's the final word for, 10 years, maybe. Until out of you people as a group, there will come one very gifted practitioner who really has that whole feeling in his hands and suddenly gets the vision that, oh my God, we can go on this way. And then it will no longer be the final word. But you see, while that word isn't clear in your own minds, and the progression of it, and the feeling of it, and the seeing of it, and the whole thing isn't literally a part of you, you cannot honestly take it and add something to it. Because all you're doing is throwing it into a hodgepodge and stirring it around.
Dr. Rolf, I'd like to, maybe if we have a few minutes, answer the question that Don...
Yes, I would like to hear that
because
answer.
it pertains very
Go
highly
ahead,
to these
go
two
ahead,
things,
go ahead,
today
go
and
ahead,
yesterday.
go ahead. I'm awfully glad you brought that up. I meant to have asked you yesterday afternoon.
Okay, this is about the idea of entropy and what entropy means. It's something that we sort of intuitively use, and maybe in a bad way, in explaining some of the structural integration effects. And to visualize entropy, let's take a deck of cards, a deck of playing cards, okay? And we compulsively order it. The reds, ace through king, and then the blacks, ace through king. Okay. And we have our ordered deck, and we're very careful with it. But we have a little accident, and we bang it and we drop it. Okay. And some of the cards are mixed up. We pick it up, and lo and behold, we see it's not quite in that perfect order that it was before we dropped it. So, well, what do? We take the deck and we shuffle it. And we look again, and lo and behold, it's even worse. And we shuffle it again, and again, and again.
That's a beautiful metaphor, and this is what I'm talking about, shuffling. That's what they're doing.
Right, so we sort of shuffle through the game of life.
That's right.
And
it's a beautiful.
every time we do that, that deck is more and more random. And this, in a nutshell, is entropy. All physical materials behave in this manner. All physical materials in a closed system. That is, a system in which energy can neither get in nor out of, tend to become more disordered, tend towards disorder, disarray. That's why physicists, when they speak of the universe becoming more disordered, that has to be because the universe is a closed system and there's no energy going in and out of the universe. So the state of the universe tends to go towards more randomness. Now,
Here, I have a question before you go on.
sure.
Does the randomness imply uniformity?
It implies not necessarily, yes, homogeneity.
So the universe at a total state of entropy would be a homogeneous mass of energy, perhaps,
That's right.
or electrons.
Of
Just a plasma.
plasma gas.
Okay.
Plasma gas. And this is, of course, one of the observations that tend to support these kinds of notions about the universe. Now, this, if you have, for example, if you had a perfect ice box, one which no heat, no energy could go in or out, and you put a cube of ice in it, that ice would melt, not because of heat, but because of the intrinsic property towards randomness. Because a solid is more ordered than a liquid, and a liquid is more ordered than a gas, and so forth. So you go along this kind of a progression. Now this process is inevitable and it's irreversible. This change, increase in entropy in a closed system, in a thermodynamically closed system. Now, it seems to me that all this is very interesting, and it tells us that we're sort of looking along the wrong track when we even use the word entropy, because we're looking for order. We're not looking for disorder. Now, it turns out that a concept, a very beautiful concept, was developed in the early 1940s due to the rapid proliferation of communication and radar in particular. There was no way of analyzing these radar signals. And so an entirely new system of mathematics was devised. This is probably the first, probably one of the major mathematical developments since Newton invented the calculus, from a theoretical standpoint of starting with new premises and so forth. And this theory is the theory of information, or information theory. Many of you are familiar with it from cybernetics. Now, information theory turns out mathematically to be identical with the entropy theory of statistical mechanics. However, it approaches it from the different direction. Instead of approaching it from the disorder, in information theory, we approach from the order. Information is a measure of order, whereas entropy is a measure of disorder. The entropy and the information are related reciprocally. Actually, it's a negative because it's a logarithmic function. So anyhow, they're identical formulations. So what we can say about information, we can say about entropy. But at least we have an idea of what to look for now. Now, let me just, anybody have a piece of paper? Large piece of paper, I think. Let me draw some of these things out. Felt pen here, too.
One of those big study markers.
Let me just, well,
Say, Lee, when you get around to it, would you phone Al and tell him if he's coming over here today? Would he be good enough to bring that paper of mine that he has? Because I want to refer back to the letter concerning this thing, Peter.
now, for those of you who have some familiarity with mathematics, I've just mentioned this equation. Now, if there are two events, x and y, with n possibilities for the first and n possibilities for the second, then the information or the ordering of their joint occurrence is given by the sum of the probabilities of their joint probabilities of occurrence times the logarithm of the joint probabilities of occurrence. What does this mean? Well, in everyday talk, we represent an information system like this. We have a source, an information source. And this source is given to a transmitter. And the transmitter transmits this source, this information, along a channel called the communication channel, where it is received by a receiver, and a message is given to the destination. So, source, transmitter, to receiver, destination. This box in the middle represents noise energy, random energy, because it's impossible to transmit something without noise. And this is the essence of the communications block, of the communication theory block. Now, the output, or the input for that matter, I need one more piece. It's represented by a series of states or elements. It can be energies, positions, momenta, tensions, elasticities, and general energies, points, states, elements. Okay, column A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so forth. This comprises a space, let us say, of the output, the space over on the receiver side. Stop me when you lose me, okay? Because these concepts are really very difficult to get across without the mathematics. Now, all of these points in the output space are connected. So forth. This comprises a space, let us say, of the output, the space over on the receiver side. Stop me when you lose me, okay? Because these concepts are really very difficult to get across without the mathematics. Now, all of these points in the output space are connected. Some connected back to others, others connected onto themselves.
What are those points again?
They are elements. Just elements. No, not random elements. They're the ordered elements.
Of what?
Just a set of ordered elements. They might be energies, they might be muscle tensions, they might be fascial elasticities, and so forth. They're, whatever the elements of the set are. It's a set. In a mathematical sense, it's a set. Now these arrows, associated with these arrows, are what you can call them probabilities. But a better word might be weighting functions. So the probability, if you start at A to get to E, might be 1 over 100. Whereas to go from A to B could be 1/5. From B to A, 1/4. From B to C, 1/20th. And so forth and so on. Each point now being related to all the other points by weighting functions. So in a system like this, to get from A to G, well, you might go from A to G directly, but that would have a very low probability, very low possibility. So you have to go from A to E, and then from A to E you could either go back to A or to D or to F, and so forth. Now, in a totally random situation, all of these probabilities would be equal. And we'd have a blob, in a sense. And one can, as a function of these weighting functions, one can say how ordered the system is. Now, a system like this, you can never say, this is it, this causes that. That makes absolutely no sense. You can say it is or it ain't sometimes, and that makes perfect sense. See, because you're not talking about cause and effect, you're talking about changing a field. And that's a key concept. You're talking about the ordering of a field, an ordering of a field of points. Now, the key question is, how do you go about making a field like this more ordered? How do you change its order? If you put in energy, and sometimes, it's kind of, we say, well, something's disordered. The shoulders are disordered, so we put energy into the shoulders and order them. And this is not true in general. Because in general, if we put energy into this system, we will tend to make it more random. If, however, from the source, we originate a message, and this message has to have energy. One can measure the energy, and it has to have a particular amount of energy. However, this has to be a very special energy, and this energy has to be ordered in a unique or in a semi-unique way, because there are maybe many orderings. And the whole theory of information now is, what are the optimal orderings? How do you know when you're getting close to them? How do you know when you're converging and you're diverging? But anyhow, you have to have a code which corresponds in some mathematical way with this space here. And the correspondence has to be in such a manner that when you transmit the energy, you will change the order of this system in a predictable fashion. Not in a this causes that, because that can't be done. This theory says such a statement is meaningless. But how can you reorder this field to change the organization of these sets of points in this field? And that is, again, by a very specially coded message, again, of probabilities, of transitions. Okay. So, I think it's not really all that far out to say that the output probabilities or transitions are some things about the body, measurable things about the body, relationships of the energies within the body, a representation of the sum of the energies of the body and their field. And the input, of course, is the manipulation. But it's not just the elbow, it's not just the energy. It's the very precise and perhaps unique set of manipulations that put energy in an ordered, precise manner that can rework this field. Okay. Now, let me add one other thing to this. In this kind of a system, you don't know the code at the beginning. So you put in a little signal, a little perturbation, actually would be a better word, and something happens, and you get feedback. You see what happens, you get feedback. And you can tell from this feedback, and from the way this feedback changes, whether you're on the right track or whether you're on the wrong track. This is called an error-correcting code. You use a code that you can take the feedback from, compare it to the original message you sent, and know whether you're becoming more ordered in the output field or less ordered in the output field, or ordered in the direction you want.
What did you call that?
An error-correcting code. Error.
Yeah.
Right. Error-correcting code. And there's a very large branch of mathematics now dealing just with this kind of a process. I think it's not unreasonable to assume that this is what goes on in structural integration, that this is a process that Dr. Rolf went through unknowingly, or unknowingly that there was a mathematics of it, doing these things, seeing the changes, changing.
But you see, when this started up, there was no information theory.
Even if there was.
Yeah, but there are so many extrinsic and intrinsic variables. So what's going in my head now is, so what? There are so many variables, and I think what you've done is explain very scientifically, what's really happening, what's going on. But now I'm wondering
You're asking what
you
use
do
it
with it? Yeah, it's a very beautiful, explicit demonstration, an explanation of everything that's happening. But so what?
Well,
Okay, I meant that it's really nothing that much more than that. But I think it's food for thought.
Well, it's really more than that.
And
It's more than that, Peter. As I say, I wrote this paper, this contribution to stress thing, and I sent it to 2 journals. And one of them sends it back and says it's completely unscientific. He didn't say completely. They said it's too unscientific. We can't publish. But you see, if in addition to the paper that I wrote, you had something that was developing your what you had just developed, and you put it next to it, you say it isn't that unscientific.
Yeah.
You demonstrate that it isn't that unscientific, and you remove this label, and then the dear people can publish it.
I think, in a sense, this is just one other help that you get from perhaps from seeing in terms of this, is you get a slightly larger view, a slightly more complete view of the process that you're involved in. Or, in other words, you get a feeling, an intuitive feeling for the process you're involved in from a slightly different angle.
I think it's very valuable, Peter. I really do. I think it's very valuable. I think it makes a great big contribution to an understanding. And where Jerry is saying there are so many variables, it's true there are so
Well, that's
many
why you
variables.
use this kind of theory.
I know, for instance, for example, there's a different feeling when you put your elbow in my back and when Fritz puts his elbow
I know
in my
that.
back.
I know
feel
that.
entirely different.
I know that.
And then there's my feelings towards you and my feeling towards Fritz. So that's what I'm talking about, all these variables.
Well, all right, all this
So
is
then-
true, but the only way you initiate something is to start with large, relatively simple blocks, putting them together, and then after you
That's right.
put those large, simple blocks together, then you realize that within the blocks, you have a system, another system, a system made up of smaller and perhaps more complicated situations. But those smaller and more complicated situations are not entirely independent. And therefore, you are now able to get into that block and change that block, the constituency of that block sufficiently that you begin to get some more responses. But you see, it's not a 100% degree of freedom. You have degrees of freedom only within limitations there.
We're just taking everything what he said as already for granted, but he just
That's
laid it
right.
out.
That's right.
He just laid it out, but this is
He
already
lays it out so that you see it differently and understand it differently. What he has said is what we're all of us experiencing all of the time.
Yeah.
What I have done is what all of us are experiencing all of the time. But as I analyze it for you, you begin to see how you've experienced it, and therefore you can control what you or the next guy is experiencing to a degree. And I think this is life experience in general.
This
I'd like to add a
discussion,
couple of examples that might make it a little more meaningful. Another word for organization is redundancy. And entropy and redundancy are reciprocal functions, and everything we do depends upon our degree or
Yeah.
percentage of redundancy. For example, our language is about 60% redundant, totally. But if you go to the dictionary and you look in the section Q, it's 100% redundant in the sense that after every Q, at the beginning of the word, there always follows a U. So this is no information. If our language were, it's about 60% redundant. If it were 55% redundant, it would be impossible to have anything like crossword puzzles. If it were 65% redundant, we could very easily have three-dimensional crossword puzzles. Now what he's doing and what we're doing here, if we get too little redundancy, then we're in a maze. We don't know what Ida's doing. We don't know what Peter's talking about, this sort of thing. And we have very individual optimum redundancy level. So if I'm 60% redundant in my thinking and you're only 55, I won't understand you. But if I'm 60 talking to you as a 55, then I'll be boring to you. And it's a very close, limited thing. And this is what's going on with the scientific, unscientific journal kind of
I
thing.
know,
That's very nice.
You were maybe too redundant or not redundant enough for
to suit the particular
To
people.
get the
that-
message through.
Yeah,
Yeah,
to suit the
very narrow
particular
organization.
people
It's a
that-
very narrow pinhole there. It comes
Yeah.
to-
Yeah.
Peter,
What
can
this-
you put an error correction code into a formula?
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
what this also says to me is that the thing that I've been unhappy about, and the reason I asked the question, was I don't feel that entropy as a concept is particularly valuable to the Rolf processing.
Oh, I think it is. If you substitute for the word entropy, randomness. Oh, I think it's very significant to
No,
me.
I think it's a question of rearranging processes rather than changing the absolute entropy.
Well,
That's what you're doing. They're synonymous.
Oh, well, I asked you before, and you said no, they weren't, or I interpreted your answer that randomness and rearrangement.
They're a precise mathematical reciprocal. But the question is, aren't we better off discussing the concept, the mathematical definition, which has something isomorphic with the concept?
Well, are we in fact decreasing entropy with processing?
Yes. Absolutely.
yes, you're
Well,
right.
I can't say absolutely. It's certainly possible.
I think
Well, I
you
think it's
also
more than
realize-
possible. I think it's probable.
The question is at what level, the key question now is what do we consider the elements of this set? When you look at the photograph, it's clear that the entropy has changed.
I see it to the totally opposite direction. I see the person who comes into the room as being much too redundant, and that we actually are increasing the entropy slightly by putting him into that middle zone where he's just right, but not so far that he goes to total randomness. In other words, we limit our destructuring.
I don't think.
But rigidity is not the same as order.
Oh, well, definitely not.
No,
Definitely not. Order is non-rigid.
I think of redundancy in terms of the right angles. That's kind of redundancy.
But order, the same
Yeah.
thing follows the same thing. I mean, what follows is predictable in order.
Yeah. But
It's too predictable in rigidity.
when you I see your code,
My what?
or the way you see this body, and so you start with order,
No.
or with not with randomness, but the rigidity.
I don't think the concept of randomness applies. That's what I'm saying. I'm
That is a good question.
questioning the concept randomness. That's what
All
I'm saying.
right, okay.
There's certainly
you're
a change in
questioning.
organization, and whether the change of organization is from randomness to greater ordering, or it's from one ordering to another ordering, which happens to be more random. It's got to be one or the other, you know. There can't be anything else. I suspect that it probably is towards more ordering.
But I see
It's got to be one or the other. You
Yeah.
either make them more random or less random. And my guess is you make them less random.
Less
What
random.
Peter sees as random, you see as something else.
I'm talking.
No,
You get to
we're
say
just.
end.
He sees them as starting with high entropy randomness, and I see him as starting with low entropy redundancy,
Yeah, you
and
just
we're
look
coming
with
this
your
way.
eyes And you come to the same
Right.
point.
We're at the same point when at the end of 10 hours, but
Right.
my concept was we came from the opposite direction.
You just see something else than he sees, but...
I see the same thing. I'm just on the other side of the mirror.
Yeah.
The thing is how we define the elements.
Yeah. And, you know, with the new physical concepts of time reversal and antimatter, it really doesn't matter which side of the mirror Peter stands on, which side I stand on. We're both on the same side, or neither of us are there at all. So, you know,
This is what happens to me every time I look into some of these modern theories, and I look at it and I read it and I fight with it and I struggle with it, and I finally get to the end of the damned article, and I finally say, there, I know what he said. And then I say, well, my God, so what? We used to say that this way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
We're in a model building society.
yeah.
And this sort of general systems theory is very applicable now, and it's very popular now. And it's
Yeah, and
recently
it's
popular.
very convincing now. This is what gets me a little bit irked. It's very convincing now. If you put it in that idiom, they think they understand it.
Right.
And if you put it in some idiom, they can't see it.
You're
So
unscientific.
you're unscientific.
You're not using their code.
Well, I understand all that, but they don't seem to.
There's a danger here too, in that I think most human beings, when we name something, we think we understand it.
This is true, and when you name it, you really just stop it in its
Right.
flow.
Photograph.
Right.
And if you stop it in the wrong place, you've got a really serious trouble on your hands.
Peter, I was interested, you said that you could put this in a code. Are you talking about a physical system, or are you talking about an organic system? Can you put an organic system into a mathematical code?
Yeah.
Well, in the last 10 years, I've seen an awful lot of attention to that exact problem. And of course, the most striking example given is the DNA business, which is a prime example of
Complicated. I mean, a
information
human
theory.
system. Can you put
Yeah.
a human system into a
Oh, yeah.
mathematical code? You know?
As it, well,
Because this is a pretty complicated organic thing that we're dealing with.
yeah. Also, I won't say yes or no. Some say yes and some say no. But certainly there's some pretty impressive high-level people who say yes.
Well, what I think is that to the extent that you can sort of take it into the 1970 jargon, you get more people looking at it, and more people being impressed by it, and as they look at it, in their looking, they're contributing energy to the idea and developing it. So that I see it as worthwhile, even though it doesn't make one darn bit of difference to the way I lay my hands on Jerry or Fritz lays his hands on Jerry. But it seems to me that it's worthwhile in the sense of there's a whole level of pretty high-level people who don't even look at it until you put it in that particular idiom that they like.
John Kennedy's campaigns were run on information theory formulas.
That's right.
I wrote an article on the therapeutic community, putting it in general systems theory language, and it was very well received.
Yeah, well, I think that this could be a decided contribution to the whole situation to develop that, Peter. Put it down into black and white words. When Al comes, he's going to bring that paper, the manuscript of that paper, that rejected paper,
I saw
plus
it.
their letter. And let's reread their letter and see what it says.
Yeah. Maybe
And
let's
then-
rewrite the paper too.
Well, maybe we rewrite the paper. Maybe we write a supplement to the paper by Peter Levine. Because as I see the progression of this in terms of publication at this point, it's going to be a a first paper which nobody understands, plus a dozen other papers, each one of which throws a little light on it, and nobody's going to really understand it till that whole dozen papers get written, then those dozen papers should go into a monograph. But the point is that the field should be defined before we get to that monograph stage, because that monograph stage may not be there for 3 years. And what we ought to do is to put our stamp to a certain extent on this field and say this is where we're working. And it should be done by free publication. Okay, somebody got some more to contribute. I think that was a wonderful contribution to the general understanding of the word.
Peter, do you remember the article? Did you read that Ed might have given it similarity people and differential? The way they see a problem, like an administrator approaches it from one point, while a scientist approaches it from the opposite point of view. And if you write an article and you are a similarity person and you give it to a publication where most of the editors are differential,
Yeah, this is the
then
problem.
they will not understand the paper unless you put the ending of the article in the beginning and give them this information first, and then the rest of the paper will make sense to them. And if you give it to a publication where the other thing is true, they will understand the paper right away. And they found in...
That really seems to be true.
Yeah,
That is
and
true,
they found
there's
this
no
in
question.
industries, that if they took the engineer's report and took the ending findings and gave this as an introduction to the administration, then they had much less conflict. Because by the time they got through the whole paper, they had lost the administration and therefore they didn't understand the ending.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, so if you rewrite an article with that in mind, you may get a result, or you may not, it's a 50-50 chance.
Well, there's also the little bit that we've been talking about back and forth for the last couple of weeks about this fourth area versus third area and fifth area versus fourth area thing, and what part of the fourth area the guy happens to be in that's reading your fourth area paper, etc., etc.
Yeah.
If he's way along toward the fifth area, you're boring him. If he's way back toward the third area, he isn't understanding it.
Yeah, that's a little different, though.
It's different. It's not as
Yeah.
practically organized. It's not as practically differentiated as what you're
But if you
saying.
take two people that are at the same level, if you approach the person with the mind that starts here, you and Peter were a very good example. That's what made me think about it. The person who sees similarities
And the person,
has a very different process of thinking from the person who sees the differences. Like I see most of the time the differences, and I think you see the similarities more than I do. And therefore, we may be on the same level, but very difficult to communicate because I start at the ending and you start at the beginning. And my beginning is your ending.
anyway, it's an awfully good point. I don't think this class should be ended next week because it's getting much better day by day. So who's got another contribution? Why start the contributions?
Oh,
Oh, what?
I like to say something about the finer body. I mostly work with the finer body in my work. And I think that when a person has gotten to the place where they are capable physically of keeping their head up, they may not be able to do it with the finer body because the finer body is still stuck back in the...
No, this isn't the way it goes. The finer body initiates it. I'm sorry, I'm not, that's the place I'm not compromising.
Yeah,
The finer body is the pattern
right.
to which the courser has to come along.
Yeah, Christ is capable of physically putting his head where it belongs. And somehow he doesn't look as though he knows yet. And this knowledge...
He doesn't know in his flesh. He knows in his head and he knows in his finer
The
body.
finer body infiltrates the flesh, the heart. You cannot separate the
That's
two.
right. I
And
agree.
if you can use a different code to give this knowledge to Fritz,
You do. You use the code with your fingertips.
But you
That's
may
the
need
code.
another code to get,
Verbalisms, you mean?
or you say you cannot get it through his thick skull. Maybe it has to come from Ian. And
That we're agreed on. That business of you can't get it through his thick skull is just a good old-fashioned.
It's just a metaphor. It may be the chest
yeah,
actually
but
that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm saying that it may be that it has to saturate him from within, and the message to get within goes in a different way than through the fingertips. And you can shorten the time it takes. But I'm sorry to choose you, but that's the best example I can think of. To shorten the time it takes his body to find this place.
Well, now, what do you think we've been doing in all these 10 hours? In the first hour, I started explaining to him, now get your waistline back and the
Your
top
head
of
up.
your head up. No, that's not the top of your head. The top of your head is a little further forward than that, or a little further back than that.
Yeah. And you...
This was my practical application of your particular words at this
Let me put
point.
it another way. You give people the bodies to live in, and maybe they need to learn how to live in it.
Yeah, but they've been hearing about it every hour that they've been in this room.
This is the habit argument a little bit. There is no
Yeah.
such thing as habit.
Yeah, Gunvor,
Yeah.
the concept I think that I hear you struggling with is the question of whether or not the finer body or instinct, incomplete gestalt, whatever you want to call it, if the question is whether left to itself, it will always make the right choice or not. And there are people who believe that if you leave the finer body to its own resources without extraneous crap put on it, like bent out of shape or head forward or whatever, that it will make the correct choice. And in that respect, the conclusion is that if you put the physical body into a place where it can respond to the finer body, that the finer body will always choose the correct
And we'll continue
structure.
to evolve.
Yeah.
And what?
I
And we'll
think-
continue to
And will continue to
And I
evolve.
think you're right.
And there's another theory that says that's not true, and I think this is what you're discussing right now.
Well,
Whether you
you
have to
see,
teach the finer body or whether it already knows.
the problem
No,
is,
no, I'm not saying
That isn't the question?
finer body. I think the finer body already knows. What I'm saying is I don't think the finer body realizes that it knows. And this realization, I think, can be done faster. And it's done with meditation, or it can be done with deep relaxation, or with a lot of different methods. And I think if we can shorten this period of realizing, of the finer body, realizing that the body is changed, and therefore it can now rely on its own knowledge.
Then we're getting into a semantic question of what are the limits of the finer body, because if it doesn't know that it knows, then you've got hierarchies and egos and super egos.
You have to believe that or not. I mean, if you believe
Yeah.
it, you believe it, and that's where a lot of the disagreement is, that some people just don't even believe in the existence of the finer body.
You can make it more concrete even than
Yeah.
that. Somebody, who carries tension, a lot of tension in their neck and their back. And there's no doubt that even after they've been processed and after they start getting uptight, they're going to start doing this business. But if for half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the evening, they lay on their back and feel these places, and feel as they breathe and as they relax, that they're coming back to the place where they were when they got up from the elbows, that's an important thing, and that's something that can't be passed over.
well, it seems to me that the thing that's lacking in this whole discussion is a recognition of the fact that people are in different places along the spectrum.
That's not causing.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. And that therefore one guy knows one guy's finer body can handle a thing and another man's can't. It's not as well developed or what have you. But I do think that in all this argument that I've heard in the last 5 minutes, we've been making the assumption that a finer body equals a finer body, which I doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's have some coffee, and George is coming first.
Right.
After.